All right, everybody, we're going to get started. I'm going to turn my camera off so that I'm just not peering down, and I'll be moving around here in the room. And so you can focus on the slides. But it's so fabulous to have you all here. I'm really excited to share updates with you and look forward to more conversations after. So here we go. So my name is Sasha Reed. I'm a scientist with the United States Geological Survey, and myself and my co-lead Andrew Feldman from NASA are going to give you an update today on ARID, which is a terrestrial ecology scoping study by NASA focused on dryland ecosystems. And I'll just check, can everybody hear okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, folks can hear?
Yes.
Online? Okay, awesome. And we've been thinking a lot about the overarching questions and motivation for the work and are working on a streamlined definition of what we think for why drylands are important, because they have so many things that are important. And we really are focusing on that, the fact that these are vast and vital ecosystems, really life support systems for our species and many other species. And we see them responding dramatically to climate change in real time. So we know that the NASA Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign would have the potential to help us understand the drivers of this change, the consequences, so that we could map and quantify and forecast this change into the future, with the idea that it would inform our decision making. And the Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign is a unique opportunity to make these scientific advances in drylands, because it is meant to focus on complex systems that are undergoing change. And so we at ARID have been working on answering and determining the big science questions in drylands. What are the things that we need to know that only a NASA terrestrial ecology scoping study can answer? And what is especially powerful about this Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign is the way that it blends satellite and aircraft data, drone measurements and towers, on the ground measurements, like the kind of science that I like to do, and then linking that all together with models so that we can better understand the systems, scale the systems, and forecast them into the future. Drylands have also always been an important test bed for our satellite and space-based measurements for NASA, and there's no exception now. And the new diversity of sensors in space and the increased spatial resolution mean drylands are even more important now for understanding our current space-based measurements and the potential for future space-based measurements. We're also really passionate about fostering collaborative interactions and building these new relationships within the scientific community. And we don't want those relationships just to be with other scientists. We know that's critical and fundamental, but we also want it to be with data users. So from the beginning, from the first day of our first workshop in October, we've invited data users such as land managers and other decision makers to come and be part of co-producing ARID, so that we could make sure that the data that we come up with will be useful and relevant and accessible. Our keynote speaker in that first event was Karen Prentice, who is the National Science Advisor of the Bureau of Land Management, very high position. And Karen talked passionately about being able to use information such as what a NASA Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign for Bureau of Land Management lands. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So why drylands? Part of it is they represent our planet's largest land biome. Over 40% of Earth's terrestrial surface are made up of these ecosystems. Over a third of the human population, billions of people, rely on drylands. Many of these people who live very tightly coupled with their environment. So as drylands are changing, which they are changing, we see these people struggle, leaving a lot of questions about what to do in the face of change. We also know that drylands produce 60% of our food. That's something that I didn't know before this scoping study. That's an amazing amount of sustenance for our species. And then drylands are playing critical roles in Earth's carbon cycle. For example, representing 40% of net primary productivity, almost 60% of the trend and the interannual variability in the terrestrial carbon sink and atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are dominated by the effect of drylands, and over 50% of our soil carbon. So drylands to a 2-meter depth represent almost a third of soil organic carbon and almost 80% of soil inorganic carbon. Soil inorganic carbon is an enormous pool of carbon that we know very little about, and that we would be able to scale and quantify and understand in the context of global change better with a focused research effort. Drylands also represent critical areas of biodiversity. So this is a map of biodiversity importance that takes into consideration species richness as a diversity metric, but also how imperiled species are, the risk that they're facing in the face of change. And we can see these important species in the southwestern United States, these bright yellow hotspots of biodiversity and imperiled at-risk biodiversity. This is true for other drylands as well. And the actual biodiversity in absolute terms is also very high. For example, the Sonoran Desert, which is not a very big desert in North America, has over 2,000 species of native plants. Some estimates put that at over 4,000, representing almost 200 families. So there's a high amount of biodiversity, as well as animals and reptiles and birds. Understanding that biodiversity is key. Something else we really like in ARID is the fact that that biodiversity is not just species richness, but many plant traits vary on small spatial scales in drylands. For example, in the plots that I have around the southwestern US, it's very common to have C3, C4, and CAM photosynthetic pathways all represented in a 2-meter by 2-meter plot. So this trait diversity, the way that dryland organisms have evolved to withstand more intense conditions, offers really exciting opportunity to better understand the systems and to better monitor the systems from space, and then to use that diversity to improve our interpretation of those space-based measurements. There's also lots of structural diversity in drylands, grasses and shrubs and trees all in the same place. So we can really start to get a handle on how structure is varying, how it's regulating function, how we can assess it at different scales, and how we can improve that assessment into the future, linking it to function. And we know that drylands face significant challenges. We have hot places, dry places getting hotter and drier. Drylands are warming well above the global mean in terms of temperature and facing significant drought. We have massive exotic plant invasions that are resulting in huge changes to wildfire regimes. Sometimes it seems like the Pyrocene in the drylands of our planet. We also have extreme events such as flooding. It's not just things getting drier, it's things getting more variable. And this affects things like the water availability to our species, ecosystem function, and the availability of provision services. Drought and aridification, one of the challenges that we talk and think about a lot in drylands. For example, the Western US is thought to be in the worst drought in over 1,200 years, and it may be much longer. It's just that that's how far our tree ring data go. Think about what was happening 1,200 years ago in the southwestern United States. That's a long time to have gone until things have been this dry. We also see in other countries like Australia, Australia's Bureau of Meteorology had to add a new color to its temperature map because the old range no longer captured how hot things are getting. And those high temperatures are in Australia's drylands. And so better understanding the effects of drier places getting drier, hotter places getting hotter is core to what we want to do with ARID. And as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing the effects of these climatic changes. Here we are in New Mexico, and this photo is from just a little bit north of us, showing massive pinyon pine mortality. Dryland trees are dying across the planet, and we're trying to understand how this hot drought, global change type drought is resulting in that. type of massive shift to community composition. We're also seeing woody encroachment, grasslands turning into shrublands. And so these wholesale shifts to plant community composition are something we could much better quantify with space-based measurements and linked with airborne, drone, and on-the-ground measurements to improve both our ability to scale these changes, to understand what these changes mean for those ecosystems and for the services and functions that they provide, and also to forecast those changes into the future so that we can make decisions and practice with mitigation and adaptation solutions in the face of that change. And those changes to ecosystems that we're seeing are posing issues for resource managers right now. What I want you to take from this figure is look at the tribal and federal lands in the US and how they are dominating the Western United States. And then in the lower left, look at where drylands are in the United States. That overlap means these resource managers are trying to make decisions in real time about ecosystems that are changing. And they're asking us for exactly the information that an ARID terrestrial ecology field campaign would be able to provide. How do we make decisions? How do we understand the implications? Another cool example is thinking about the funding that the federal government gave to land management agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, the Forest Service, billions of dollars for restoration to try to help support these ecosystems. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had the remote sensing and modeling tools to better understand the outcomes and the drivers of those outcomes in drylands? Many of those billions of dollars are going to be spent in drylands in the Western United States because, as you can see, that's where our federal lands are. But it's not just about those of us who live in drylands. Even though Vegas is a dryland, what happens in drylands doesn't stay in drylands. We know there are many ways that drylands affect the global system. Here on the left, showing the semi-arid contribution to the trend and interannual variability in the terrestrial carbon sink and atmospheric CO2. We have high uncertainty about how drylands are going to feed back to climate change with these large changes that we're seeing across vast landscapes. There are exact same questions to be asked about energy balance and albedo. Drylands exchange enormous amounts of energy with our atmosphere, and better understanding how climate could be affected by dryland changes to energy balance is really critical, has the potential to have huge effect. And then there are things that cross across drylands to other systems like dust. They pose human health threats, for example, carrying disease like valley fever. And then also dust is the second largest cause of vehicular death in Arizona. We are putting people at risk because we don't understand exactly how we can manage for these dryland systems and the way they transport resources. And it's not just bad things. It's also, we know that drylands are fertilizing tropical forests through their dust that they move across systems, but we don't have that quantitative handle on how these ecosystems are functioning and how they're going to move across the world in their effect and growing. They're expected to grow to over 50% by 2100 of Earth's land surface. How do we better understand these systems? How do we quantify them? A cross-scale interdisciplinary approach is really what's needed. And we want that approach to not only be other scientists, but as I've already said, the data users who are engaging at every step in the process. We want to hear what their needs are. We want to hear about how data delivery can be most effective. We want them to feel like they had a seat at the table at the beginning, because we know co-production is key to data being used. And NASA has the opportunity to support all of these different types of organizations, making up huge areas of our nation and of other nations in such an exciting new way, because the tools are ready. We also know that we're not capturing dryland carbon cycling variability. So if you look at each of these figures from Tosh McBean and her co-authors, on the x-axis, you'll see site net ecosystem exchange, which is from 12 eddy covariance towers in the southwestern United States. And then on the left-hand side, is the model estimates of that net ecosystem exchange using dynamic global vegetation models. And if the models were perfectly capturing the site net ecosystem exchange, we would expect them to fall on that one-to-one line. And we see that they are most certainly not. And that this is a big source of uncertainty in our understanding of the carbon cycle. Another really exciting part of this paper is that Tosh and her co-authors were able to show that it's really likely that it's how we're representing soil moisture controls over carbon cycling that's missing. And it's not just that those data exist and the models aren't getting it right, it's that we don't have that understanding yet to put richly in the models. And that's something an ARID terrestrial field campaign could do, get that scalable understanding of moisture controls, how water and carbon are linked, so we can build that understanding into our models in order to parameterize and evaluate them in much more powerful ways. As I said, it's not just carbon, it's what we eat too. I guess we eat carbon, but being able to understand food security issues, satellite-based measurements are so powerful in thinking about how land cover is changing, particularly in drylands. We know that drylands not only produce so much of our food, but they're also seeing cropland expansion in many drylands. At the same time, in the southwestern United States, we're talking about agricultural abandonment, that we're not going to have the water to support those irrigated crops anymore. What will that mean? How do we understand and give thoughts on which crops and which locations might be prioritized for abandonment? How do we understand what kind of restoration or action we could take post-abandonment to avoid the dust storms that could come from those lands? And this is something that ARID could provide. And rangelands as well. They are the most extensive global land use, supporting over 1 billion people. And as I said earlier, though many of those are people who don't have a lot of options for moving or changing professions. We know that these rangelands are changing through things like woody encroachment, changes to composition and fire regimes and climate change. And also the expectation is that our US rangelands, which are quite extensive, as you can see here, will become warmer and drier. How do we help ranchers and public land managers and tribal land managers better understand their options for grazing and browsing in the face of that change? And so we really want to be able to go from the organism level to the planet level. And it's not just plants, though we do care a lot about plants, animals, and the microbes and the biological soil crusts are all part of this picture. And the Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign can allow us to think and better understand the organism level, the landscape scale, how regions are being affected, and then the biome as a whole. And now is the right time. There have never been so many sensors at such high resolution to actually capture the type of spatial and temporal variability that we see in drylands. We can do this now in space-based measurements and can improve those measurements in a way that would have been much more difficult in the past because of the advances of current and future missions. It's not just satellite data that are improved, but also our on-the-ground data, the way that we can collect high temporal resolution data from plants and soils in a way that was previously not possible. Drones have exploded as a much more powerful tool, and aircrafts being able to link across these scales to better understand these ecosystems. We can do that now in a way that wasn't possible in the past, and we can revolutionize our understanding of drylands and also improve the tools that we use to understand them at the same time. One of the things we've evolved greatly. ARID has grown and evolved with all of your spectacular input. And one of those places of evolution from us and what we've learned from you is a much better understanding of the data that already exist, that we can use to be able, those data alone can't answer these questions. They weren't collected for those reasons. They don't have those right variables, but we can leverage them enormously with new data collection to get much more inference about the dryland system and to put at use these data that have already been committed to and dollars spent on in cool, exciting new ways. ARID can be the glue and the puzzle pieces between all of these different data sets. And so we are working on the terrestrial ecology field campaign scoping process. There's another scoping study called Pangea focused on tropical forests. That's really exciting. You should check out what they're doing too. You can find them online. Both teams are working now to query the community to get those big science questions. We will then hope that NASA will be able to select one or both, but potentially neither of us, to move forward for the terrestrial ecology campaign itself. They would build an exciting science definition team and then think about how long and what resources might be available in order to support this work. And the scoping study is tasked with identifying scientific questions, being able to think about the big questions, developing that initial study design. And a big part of what we want to do is support the next generation of ecosystem scientists. We had amazing conversations yesterday about how tribal scientists could be supported by an effort like ARID, thinking outside the box for ways. There was an image that Dennis Dye of SIPI talked about lighting little fires, giving students opportunities to see science in action, to interact with mentors, and then watching that turn into the big fire of their amazing career and moving forward. And that really has happened with past terrestrial ecology field campaigns. I was a graduate student during the large-scale biosphere atmosphere terrestrial ecology field campaign focused on tropical forests. And it was enormous in giving me opportunity to learn more science, to do more science above the current terrestrial ecology field campaign focused on Arctic and boreal ecosystems has shepherded incredible students into postdocs, into professors. These long-term science capabilities allow for the type of support that allows us to understand ecosystems and build the kinds of tools we want, but also to support that next generation of scientists. And so this is the initial ARID straw man formula that we used. We relied on the incredible way that the above group and from National Science Foundation was this thinking about vulnerability and response, thinking about drivers of change, ecosystem responses, the services and human systems associated with those ecosystems and their responses, and then focusing on solutions. We're not just thinking about the fact that things are changing. We know they're changing. We want to quantify that change, but we want to think actively about what we do in the face of that change. And I really do believe that we could revolutionize our understanding and predictive capacity for drylands with a terrestrial ecology field campaign, crossing tools, crossing scales, this group of people coming together to ask these questions and to think about fundamental science, cutting edge science, but also to think about actionable science, science that can move directly into the hands of those who can use it. And this team is dedicated to that. This is just such an amazing group of people. I couldn't have loved what we're doing together more and enjoy being together all the time. And part of that is our institutional diversity. We really come from federal agencies, NGOs, academic institutions. We want to think about having different partners and stakeholders and how ARID could meet all of these different goals. And so the last slide before I turn it over to Andrew, I think putting all these things together, we at ARID feel like the time is really right now for a drylands-focused terrestrial ecology field campaign. The technology, both space-based and other, is really ready. The research community, we just get tens of emails a day, hundreds of people interested in being a part of groups to help determine the themes and big questions and approaches. And the data users really are on board and want our help. NASA has a unique opportunity to support decision-making in these ecosystems and in very exciting ways. And those advances that we could make would be significant, we feel. They wouldn't be incremental. We could really do a lot to understand these systems and to forecast these systems and to think about solutions in these systems that are changing. And we want that to be a part of the plan from the beginning so that it's the most likely that the data and new knowledge that ARID could create and blend with existing data to be useful, usable, and used. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, and thank you all so much for being here. It just brings a lot of joy to my heart. So thank you.
Right. Well, thanks everyone. Yeah, Andrew Feldman from NASA Goddard Space Flight Center and University of Maryland. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. I hope Sasha convinced you how important drylands are at this point. I think as Earth science community, there's a good amount of science going on in drylands, but I think as a collective group, we've been putting off a lot of big science questions for a long time. And so beyond bringing the science community together from different corners of field science and remote sensing science and modelers. If we bring all these folks together, we can do some really big things here. And I'm just whittling down to two things here, but there's a long list. But these are two that are quite important. One is the global carbon cycle. Determining degree to which drylands ecosystems are driving the global carbon cycle. This is still somewhat of an unanswered question, and some recent research is showing it's probably pretty big, much bigger than we thought. It's especially variability and extremes are driving the carbon cycle through drylands. So reducing uncertainty and quantifying this is a big thing we hope to come away with ARID. Another thing is there's a lot of people that live in drylands, and we don't have to go to the end of CMIP models at 2099 to see all of the change and extremes that are happening. We can see it right now. There's lots of extremes from droughts and heat waves. People are feeling the effects, and we need to bring actionable data into end user decision frameworks across the Western US and in many international communities. So these are two very big things I think we can come away with ARID. There's a long list of other ones, again, because I feel as if we've been putting off some of these questions for quite some time as a community. So a big message I'm going to send here for the rest of this talk is that we've been listening to you. We're coming here updating you all with what you've all been telling us that you think is important. And, you know, we started out with some original science themes up on the left there of our white paper, of our scoping proposal. On the right is where we're heading. This is from tons of survey feedback, many webinars, town halls. We're putting all this together, and we're changing our science themes based on what you're all saying. And I'm connecting these back here, just showing you very rudimentarily how we're connecting our science themes back to our core pillars of understanding drivers of change and ecosystem response, the fundamental science questions here, you know, thinking about fire, climate variability. A lot of these things are very unique to drylands, pulse dynamics. And then going into dryland response, thinking about vegetation structure and biodiversity. Dryland geology and soil processes are very important. Biocrusts, mining is very important in drylands. Carbon stocks, of course, there's so many, reducing the carbon cycle uncertainty, getting better estimates of carbon cycle variability and responses in drylands is very key. And then at the bottom there, but not very much, last but not least, cropland and rangeland management services. This is starting to get into Earth science to action goals that we have at NASA. You know, how are we managing crops and rangelands under variability and change, under extremes? Adaptation and mitigation. Now we're changing that verb that above used for vulnerability. Now we're thinking about adapting. We're seeing change already. How are we responding to this change? So I'm going to run through a couple of these here just to give you a better idea of the types of questions we're asking, and we're putting together our white paper right now. So these are some of the main questions coming out of each snippet of each science theme. So water availability, how is the mean changing water availability impacting drylands? So this is very much a broad question, and you know, we're talking a lot about carbon here, but carbon and water are inherently very coupled in drylands. So you can synonymously use carbon and water interchangeably a bit here. The water cycle is responding too, and synonymous and coupled to the carbon cycle. And then climate variability, pulses, drought. There's a lot of variability in drylands, so it's almost separate from the mean, a change of water availability. So thinking about heterogeneous rainfall pulses in space and time, and then frequency and intensity of droughts. Fire. Fire is a huge part of dryland dynamics. How this interacts with biodiversity, structure of drylands, a huge question, and still tons of work to be done here. Land atmosphere interactions, that's mediating a lot of these exchanges between land and atmosphere for all these questions we've just mentioned. Carbon stocks and fluxes, Tucker's going to give a talk in a few minutes here about how there's a lot of unseen carbon. Since we have new remote sensing technology and field data, we can now get a little bit better estimates, or a lot better estimates of carbon stocks. And if we zoom in a bit more with Maxar data, we can see a lot of carbon in drylands that we originally haven't estimated. So, using these new tools to understand carbon stocks and fluxes is very important. And then, of course, vegetation structure, biodiversity, heterogeneity. What's the distribution of vegetation? This is inherently related to carbon stocks. And then dryland soil and geology. Also, a lot of key things we haven't thought about a lot in a global context. Biocrust. How is biocrust playing a role in drylands? How's mining playing a role in dryland as a natural resource? And then cropland and rangeland management. How are producers, conservation scientists, and others responding to change? They're very concerned. When you speak to end users, they are very concerned about change. We've been talking a lot to end users. They are concerned about extremes and unprecedented climate that they're seeing where they live. Of course, ecosystem services, adaptation. How are our end users adapting? Land managers, especially tribal nations, how are they responding to change? How are they adapting in the face of new stressors that they haven't seen before? Lower water availability, a lot bigger extremes, a lot more variability throughout the year. So this is our nice landscape figure. I think there's a couple things to point out here that we're trying to capture, but a big one is that drylands are quite diverse. They can be very green, they can be more brown, but they're often a lot of times they have a very unique looking landscape. So when we're saying drylands, some folks that don't live in drylands might think of what's on the left there, that hyper-arid ecosystem. They might see it as a very unproductive place, but actually they span a wide range. It's just the common ground is that there's water limited. So you see a lot of different types of ecosystem. You see a lot of different activity within these ecosystems, mountainous, non-mountainous terrain, and you see a lot of land managers. A lot of people live in these ecosystems, as Sasha said. So a lot of management that's going on in these ecosystems. And so what would ARID do? ARID would nest the flux towers, ground measurements, drones, aircraft with the satellite data that NASA has. So there's quite a lot of work to be done with that, bringing in new ground measurements, potentially drones, and some new aircraft data to supplement some existing data that we've seen come out of some existing campaigns that we've seen. It would be a pretty big help for answering a lot of these questions we've mentioned, especially carbon and water cycle related. So where is our domain? We're still talking about this as a very debated topic amongst us. There's a lot of interest in many different regions. There's a lot of drylands out there. So zooming in now is a big key thing we're trying to do. But we've listened to all of you. Again, we listened to the survey feedback. There's tons of feedback on where we'd like to go. Western US is still a pretty dominant part of where we want to do some of our work. So I'd say really half of our campaign would be in the Western US, particularly parts of the Southwestern US. But the red arrows, there are some places we've had some very extensive discussions with institutions, land managers, collaborators. Just a few examples of some more extensive discussions. We've had discussions also in Central Asia as well. So there's quite a lot of discussions going on. There's so many, too many to count, honestly. But the arrows we're drawing to, there are some very potential likely sites that we'd have collaborators that we could co-develop with, that would co-fund work if ARID were funded. And then zooming into the Western US, if this were only a Western US project, you get a lot of key features in the West. There's a lot of existing instrumentation. There's some previous field campaigns, a lot of data to leverage. The science community hasn't necessarily been involved in all of those field studies. There's been a lot of data measurement and collection, but not a lot of science with that data. So how are we going to leverage that throughout the West? There's tons of gradients. We have hot to cold gradients from north to south. East to west, we have dry to wet gradients. There's a lot of cool work we could do along transects. Rangeland to cropland gradients. Once we move a bit east from Colorado into Kansas, we get rangeland to cropland gradients that we can utilize, understand land management questions in these locations. Drylands in the Western US don't capture all the variability across the globe. Drylands are very unique across the globe. We would like to do international work, but we at least get the mean water availability in the West. So we're capturing at least a pretty representative ecosystem in these locations. And so just showing some survey feedback, some raw data that we're getting. Again, I'm just showing you, we've been listening to all of you, all the frequency of mentions of certain US states and international locations. About half of the survey respondents, looking at the lower left there, mentioned that they wanted work done in the US states. Another half said international locations, and particularly southern part of Africa was a big one that was mentioned many times, and same with Mexico. Some of this was a little bit surprising to us too. We didn't necessarily anticipate that these were going to be locations that came out the most, but we're listening, and I think we've done a ton of engagement based on your feedback and started a lot of conversations in Southern Africa, Okavango Research Institute, Gobabeb Namib Institute in Namibia, South Africa, building on Bioscape, the NASA project, and then also Australia. Tons of conversations we're having in Australia, right? And some more survey feedback. I just want to mention, we're getting a ton of early career support. We're super stoked about this. Early career people are coming out and giving tons of responses. Early career scientists are going to be the ones involved in this work for the duration of it. I mean, this could be a 10-year project and beyond. From today forward, this could go well into the 2030s. So these are the folks that are to be involved, and it's a key part of these terrestrial ecology field campaigns. And we're very excited to see so many early career scientists getting involved. And on the bottom right there, I'm just showing frequency of mentions of the different science themes. We used all of that data to organize our science themes there. So we're really listening to all of you, and continue to send your feedback, please. And Sasha showed a bunch of the logos there, but I'm just breaking down a little bit more some of the domestic and international partnerships that we've been building. There's a ton, and we're trying to follow up with many different people here, but just showing you some of the examples of the names. Bureau of Land Management is a big one. National Park Service is a big one. USDA, all of the Agricultural Research Service, ARS, all of the different centers across the West are very important folks. NEON, LTER, LTAR sites. Cyverse and data infrastructure teams, FluxNet, Ameriflux, a lot of different teams domestically, a lot of tribal nations that are getting involved now in ARID. And then internationally, again, mentioning a lot of different institutes and collaborations that we're talking to. Again, a lot of which you've all sent to us. So we really appreciate the feedback, and please continue sending that. Sasha mentioned the data end users. We're listening to data end users, and these are more targeted one-on-one discussions. I'm saying 30 data end users. It doesn't sound like a lot of folks, but these are very targeted discussions. It's very important. They're telling us data needs. We're hearing a lot about how we need to zoom in a lot for their data to help with, with their different applications, understanding invasive species in national parks. We need to get high resolution data, and sometimes high temporal resolution, high spatial and high temporal resolution data to help with these applications. Hyperspectral data for mining companies. These are important key pieces that we're trying to understand for data users, and we're having individualized conversations, understanding their user front, their data, their end user decision-making frameworks are very key for a lot of our processes here. So that was, again, a lot of the big kickoff meeting in Arizona. Again, town halls and webinars, we're listening to all of you just like we're doing right now. Please send us all of your feedback and thoughts. And this is something we're building on a lot more. We had a lot of questions when we started our scoping study. How are we going to engage tribal nations? And this is a very challenging endeavor. I can call a lot of the scientists here and have an individual conversation. We know each other very quickly. We have an established relationship. If we don't know each other, we can look up each other's pages. There's an existing trust that's established. That's not the case all the time with tribal nations. It takes a lot of time to build trust, get folks to respond, having existing relationships. There's a lot of one-on-one relationship building. So this strategy has a different time scale. This is not going to be, we have 100 tribal scientists involved by December. This is not going to happen. We need to build individual relationships that last for longer than the scoping study is going to go, for longer than ARID would go. So we're doing a lot of listening. We had a tribal nations, several members and representatives of tribal nations come with us yesterday, and we had a lot of extensive conversations about how they have their own resources, managers and scientists, and we have to listen to their needs. That they have individualized needs. We can't listen to individual scientists be representatives for all of tribal nations. We have a lot of different tribal nations with many different needs. So we have to ask these individual questions. I'm listing a few on the bottom there: management and technical needs, science needs, education and career needs, data sovereignty needs. These are different sometimes for each tribal nation. So these are questions we have to ask each individual tribal nation. and work up even to the level of tribal leadership and elders to get and knowledge holders, and getting every section of the tribal nations involved. These folks are very interested, and they're super excited for us to reach out so early and be involved in the scoping study. A lot of times they're included very late in the process. And so we're including tribal nations members on our team now to help drive our process. And these are just a few examples of some of the relationships. Tribal liaisons and different initiatives have been extremely helpful for us in making connections. I'm just listing a few at the top. There's several more. And I'm also listing a few of the tribal nations we've been speaking to more extensively. Again, there are many in the West. You know, I don't know the exact numbers, but there's many pueblos and there's many different tribal nations just in the Southwest. And so I'm just listing a few here that we're having conversations with. Even within Navajo Nation, we learned yesterday, is the size of West Virginia. And so there's different parts of Navajo Nation might have different needs and different structures and how they would handle using data for different land management focuses. So these are different things we're building into our framework right now. We want to lay a groundwork for continued tribal nation involvement in ARID, and also learn from tribal nations as well. These folks know the land very well many times. So I'm going to end here and just mention this is our continued work going on. We have in September, we're going to submit our white paper draft to the CCE office at Goddard. And along with Pangea, we're going to look for community comment. But before that, we're building our outline, our white paper outline. Please join our technical working groups. We have 140 signups. We're trying to figure out meaningful ways to engage with everybody that's signing up. Please continue to join those meetings. We have awesome folks joining. We'll have different cool talks and special lectures in each of these, and just try to build an understanding of each approach and how this would, how ARID can be developed through modeling, remote sensing, field data. And then the final white paper will be submitted in December. So please, again, continue to be involved with us. Send us emails, continue to take the surveys. You'll see some more surveys coming out. We're going to be doing some more targeted end user surveys. And we might also ask about specific types of data sets. So keep a lookout for some emails from us.